Hello everyone, welcome to an early edition of the Orphan's Tales Live reading series. We are well into the spooky season, so it's not quite as glaring a difference in the lighting as it was midsummer when I did a 7 o'clock one. I've got a 8 o'clock Zoom event. I guess it's not technically Zoom, but I've got an 8 o'clock event tonight, so I'm having to do it a little bit early. Hopefully no one minds. It's been a very busy day, so my brain's a little jangled, so this will be a nice sort of come down from everything I'm doing. I'm editing a manuscript and running around like crazy, trying to get things done, and now I've got 3 hours in front of a camera staring me down tonight, so this should be a lot. So I'll do my intro as usual, and we'll get right into it. Welcome, as usual. For legal reasons, this is not an audiobook of The Orphan's Tales. This is a one-woman show. You can get music based on these books at sjtucker.com. You can get copies of them at your local independent bookseller's web portal, or if you would like to support mine, it is printbookstore.com. You can find me on Twitter at Cat Valenti. You can subscribe to my Patreon at Cat Valenti. You can catch up in the archive at Cat Valenti Live on YouTube. And you can ask me questions when the reading is done. Yes, even tonight when I am dashing off to another event. And it does work a little better if you think of what you might want to ask before the reading ends, so we don't have any uncomfortable dead time. And if you are so moved, you can put a tip in the tip jar. Toss a coin to your witch. It is on my Instagram profile, my YouTube profile, and my website, which is catherinemvalenti.com. The lipstick tonight is NYX Glitter Goals in Bloodstone. The wine is Côte du Rhône. It's got some French name. I don't remember what the specific brand is called. Sorry if you were hoping to drink along. And the book, as it has been for some time now, is The Orphan's Tales. If you are reading along at home, we are on page 303. Zooming right along with this thing, and we'll just jump right in. Since it is an earlier hour, I think we'll probably have a smaller audience tonight and people will catch up later. So let's get through our nightly pages. The violinist's tale continued. My father did not like Our much. He felt that she never got the crook of her finger quite right when she sipped her tea. I did not have the heart to tell him how difficult it was for her to sip tea at all, how many catches and sieves I had to fix in her throat before every luncheon just so that he might love her a little. He did not. And so, having exhausted the amusements of whalebone harps and watercress, we set roosters aside entirely and came south. We did not intend Agenab, but sooner or later most folk of a certain temperament find themselves here. In a city of artists and thieves, I am not entirely out of place. An hour mends the clocks. I am a good mother. I wind her every day. She is precise and perfect, and so too the bells of Agenab are as accurate as the sunrise and never fail. The old inventor took Hour's hand, which looked as though it had been cut from a soldier's metal fist, in hers, and patted it fondly like a grandmother proud of her cleverest child. The automaton knelt with a strange and awkward grace and laid her head on Folio's shoulder. My mother was right. All the wonders of Agenab were authored in that little shack. And so, too, they authored my hands. Following Hour's suggestion, 10 long bows were fashioned, not only of fine wood, both red and dark, but within each stalk Folio laid a strand of her wiry hair and a trickle of quicksilver. No mere horsehair was strung from tip to tip either, but Folio sent a boy with a coin to find the circus master and ask after his mermaid, who had died of most unfortunate gout. Finally, 10 slender bows lay on the table, torchlight flickering on their polished surfaces. I am no musician, but I would say these are the finest bows made. Being somewhat more dense in those days than I have since become, I did not quite understand even then what she intended. Folio laughed at my perplexed expression. Didn't your mother ever read you stories about little girls who make deals with the devil for the sake of a violin? I I've told Our dozens. What then should we make of a devil who makes deals with an old woman? I think we should say that anything worth doing is worth shedding blood over. Folio laid my hand flat on the table and gently closed a vice around my wrist to keep it in place. I am sorry, said Our, her throat clicking and whirring. This will hurt very much. It will be like the time that Mother gave me a new arm in place of a wing. There was blood. A great deal. And a little dribble of fire. But not much fire. Not very much at all. The tale of the cage of ivory and the cage of iron continued. I pulled a persimmon from the tree and roasted it lightly for her on my thumb. Agrafena smiled beautifully, her teeth gleaming slightly orange. Or perhaps I only wished to see them so. She allowed me to feed her the fruit, its skin brown and bubbling, as her own hands were indelicate. She took my old violin as payment, Agrafena said when she swallowed the last morsel, the lava and fire fiddle that my grandfather hoped would serve me all my days. I watched her as she fit the fiery blue bowstring to whatever strange object it was that allowed Our to talk. She took it out. Our was mute for days, and opened it up on her workbench, spooling the string inside. I looked. It looked like a music box fashioned from the red stuff of a rooster's coxcomb, but Our's voice was much better after that. We rose and walked deeper into the city still, the streets inclining downward like water swirling toward a basin drain. My parents were horrified. My grandparents roared with delight. My grandfather's fire beard was never so bright. But I found that if I did not play every day, if I did not dance, if I did not oil my hair and tighten the leather that lashes my fingers to my arms, I would shake and shiver like a starving beast. I knew peace only when I played, and so I went into the city where a playing beast can earn her supper. Such is the fate of devils who bargain for their fiddles. She stared ahead of her into the murky distance. Basil died first, you know, so fragile. My parents went to plant medicinal wildflowers outside of Urim, and I stayed. I stayed with Ajanat to watch her die and hold her old red head in my arms. We were passing through a section of town which was at once resplendent and shabby, spangled and torn. Every house's door had a curtain of some deep red or purple or green shade drawn over it, tasseled in gold. Where the drapes were drawn aside, there were ornate knockers, a griffin or a lizard or an open mouth whose tongue clacked against its lip. We've got an illustration of a knocker here. But the velvet was worn through in many places, even burned through, and the tassels were unraveling, and the finish on the knockers was rubbed away by countless fingers. Every window had a cascade of flowers, lilies and roses and honeysuckle, and each was wilted and fading, brown at the petals, slumped over the sill. The air was full of dead sweetness. The whole quarter, full of trilling songs, scales sung up and down by tenors and mezzo-sopranos, bombastic arias shattering goblets in every parlor. There was a little square where the road split, and on it was a stage with long, tall supports and a checkerboard floor, long strips of turquoise satin undulating along its rear edge to represent the sea, and a red ship carved ornately and bobbing upon it. The silk was threadbare, and the ship had lost one mast already, but in the torchlight one could hardly see those things. There were 2 men on the stage, singing fit to burst barrels, their voices punching holes in the night air. There was no audience, but in the wings a chorus was hurriedly pulling on tights and rouging their cheeks, urgent and excited. Who are they performing for? I asked. Agrafena smiled sadly. There are no audiences in Ajanab. We all act. We all observe. Yet it is no less vital that the theater be perfectly timed, that the songs be on key, that the sculptures breathe as though living. This is the opera ghetto. Poor things. The opera was always such an expensive profession. I can play my songs whenever I like, but where are they to get more rouge? Where are they to replace the shoes of the ballet corps? But they are brave and true, and there are performances every night and matinees twice weekly. They are as faithful as husbands. We watched the tiny opera for a time, and the women danced like no women I have ever seen, their parrot-feathered dresses more stalk than feather, a few strands of blue and green trailing behind them as they leapt across the stage. A girl in stilts and horns embraced a high tenor in an outlandish seal's head with one eye missing, and I was ashamed to watch their passion. I wanted to give them peace and privacy, though that is surely silly, and so I fixed my eyes at the foot of the stage while her voice spiraled up to the moonless night with the torch sparks. At the foot of the stage was a little mound capped with a stone plaque, littered with ginger roots and faces whittled wetly into their yellow flesh and rough bouquets of violets, sheet music burnt at the edges and satin laces of cast-off stage shoes. While I studied this diminutive monument, the show ended and the dancers stepped lightly from the stage into their homes, scraping their rouge carefully into little wooden pots, saving it for the next show. The tenor sat down on the edge of the stage and grinned at us through his tottering papier-mâché head. "Brought your country cousin to see the sights, Fina." "Hardly. Take that stupid thing off, Arioso. I never liked that story." He lifted the seal head from his shoulders and tossed it lightly aside. Several whiskers fell out on the stage. Under the mask, he had the head of a great brown bear, with yellow teeth and a torn ear. I caught my breath. "Don't look so shocked, burnt face. A head is a head." He put his hands to his chin and lifted off the bear's head, under which he had the clapping, flapping beak of a pelican. Calling gleefully, he wrenched the bird head off by the throat pouch with one hand. Beneath it, he was a very handsome young man, with a curly white wig and penciled eyebrows. Unceremoniously, he ripped his curls away. Beneath that, he had the long-eared, sleek-furred head of a jackal, with a small black nose, and his jaw was very fierce. I waited, but he did not remove that one. "Is that all?" I ventured. "Maybe," he said, still grinning. "We haven't time for this. Come, Scald, a night does not last forever, even in Ashanab." "Wait, wait," the jackal-headed man cried, bounding off the stage. "She was looking at the grave. She wants to know the tale. I saw her. I know she does. I can feel it in my ticket-burdened bones. It's been so long since we had anyone to talk to who didn't know our every libretto and score, Agrafina. You can't keep her all to yourself." "I do know your every libretto and score, Arioso, and besides that, I know there is an army camped outside Simeon this very night, an army which contained this one until recently. Now, do you think you can leave me in peace?" "An army? Think of the full seats." A glare from the violinist silenced him for just a moment. "But Fina, darling, you must let me have her for a few moments. Don't be selfish. Don't you know why the fields died, Smoke Bones? Let me tell her." "The fields died because they were farmed dry for century upon century," grumbled Agrafina, scratching her shoulder blades with a long, slender bow. "Ha!" His small black face was alight with eagerness, his pink tongue panting in and out. "That's what you say. But what kind of opera would that make, I have never been one for Verissimo. Let me tell her the better tale. Let me tell her about the duchesses." The tale of the two duchesses. In days gone by, when the palms were green and high and the saffron threads were stitched into the aprons of young girls with milk still on their breath, Ashanab was a duchy. This is not to be wondered at. No city so absurd, so beguiling and barbaric as ours would tolerate a king. Dukes are far more likely to lose their daughters to enchanted forests or find themselves shipwrecked on sinister isles. This is a keener expression of the Ajan character than a dotard with a crown teetering on his bald head. It so happened that the Duke had a lovely daughter, as dukes are prone to do. Her hair was golden as a rooster's breast, her eyes bluer than the bay tide. It was clear enough that the Duke's wife had been a foreigner, but no one ever saw her. The Duke had it put about that she had died in childbed, and this was common enough that no one suspected otherwise. The child had such sweet pink cheeks and a laugh like silver falling from a sparrow's mouth, and all loved her. She was called Ulissa. Now it so happened that in the poorer quarters of Ashanab, in the slosh slough of the Vareni, which flows through the left-hand side of the city like a giant's tears, another child was born on the lowest floor of a red and pock-marked tenement, which is to say lower even than the street itself, for such buildings house the poorest folk below the grates and below the ground. This child also had golden hair and eyes like the sparkling of the sun on the sea, and a laugh like gold coins falling from a grackl's mouth, and in all her sad little rookery, and all in her sad little rookery doted upon her. Her name was Orphea, and in every way she was identical to the Duke's daughter, though Orphea's mother was nothing but a seamstress with needles in her mouth and dirty blonde hair, sweat plastered across broad cheeks. And Ulysses' mother's body was carried through the streets in a closed casket, all of mother of pearl. Think not that this is strange, for in the theatre we see it happen as often as not, and we are undisturbed. Now, as these children grew, the Vereni flowed thick and rich as rents, and Ulyssa had the best tutors to ply her fingers on the glass harpsichord, while Orphea sang her own little songs in the morning while she folded her mother's work, and both were happy as girls can be. Of course, Ulyssa sang as beautifully as any flute might play, and longed to walk upon the stage jeweled in glass instead of rubies, and sing of unfortunate love and tame bears and a life on the sea. She sang arias until her father prayed her to give him peace, for he did not approve of the opera, and even then she whispered them to herself beneath her blankets. And of course Orphea, who sewed the garments of others as day dawned and day set, longed to have enough silk and trim to fashion something of her own. But even her mother's scraps were too fine and precious for a young girl to be allowed to touch them, and were resold at market to buy their milk. Instead, Orphea, quick and clever, caught the vermin of her tenements and skinned them, boiling mouse stew and rat stew and mole stew, possum stew and chipmunk stew and weasel stew. Her best dress was made of these weasel skins, and it was softer than anything her mother ever mended. And when they were grown as two swans with their heads bent heartwise, they happened to meet upon the roadside. Orphea was on her way to fill her basket with turmeric and blueberries at the market, and Ulyssa to have her best boots mended. Can you not see this scene in its proper regalia, staged and sung? The two sopranos in their golden wigs, the glorious set pieces. We perform the two duchesses once a year in their honor. You must come. And so it was. And you must, in your mind, see it as it is rightly shown, with Ulyssa in her ermine and black bodice and a little crown of netted silver over plush blue linen, and Orphea in her weasel rags, her plump calves showing, her feet all bare and humble. You must imagine it, how they each dropped their burdens in shock and surprise, how they touched each other's peculiar curls, how they exclaimed in wonder. "Why, you could be my mirror, walking the streets like a girl," cried Ulyssa. "Why should I be your mirror just because you can afford glass? You could as well be mine, and how dare you walk strumpet proud, bearing my face?" "Let us not be enemies," said the Duke's daughter. "What fun we might have if we were allies." And so it was decided. Ulyssa would go into the slums and sing for her supper, and Orphea would wear ermine and laced corsets. Neither was entirely sure that she would be as happy in her new life as in her old, but it seemed too good a trick to not play at least once, and besides, Ulyssa had seen many an opera in which this sort of thing turned out reasonably well. Once a month they would meet and exchange clothing again, and go to rest in the arms of Orphea's broad-cheeked mother and Ulyssa's white-coated father for a single day before separating again. And for a long while this was a very satisfactory arrangement. Ulyssa rose quickly among the actresses of Vereni's side, for her hair was golden and her eyes were blue, and even in these parts it is well enough known that this is the proper mask of an ingenue. Because of her high bearing and her cultured voice, she earned for herself the nickname of the Duchess, and laughed every night to her own heart in a shabby bedroom where bottles of perfume stood dusty and dear, where Orphea had boiled water with rose petals and rose hips floating pink and red until some thin scent could be gleaned. Ulyssa would touch these bottles and smile, and think of her far-off friend. Orphea, for her part, learned to dance in very complicated ways and in very complicated dresses, and though she liked the Duke very much, that she thought he was odd and haggard about the eyes, she did not dare ask about the golden-haired woman who had once lived there. but on her lace-covered table there were costly oils of frankincense and rosewater and ambergris, and she touched them with wonder and thought of her far-off friend. Each month, they met in a courtyard, far from the center of anything, peppered with persimmon trees and coconut shells. Orphea would take her weasel skin dress in hand with joy and help Ulissa into the black gown she loved so well and arrange her familiar hair under the glittering snood. But one month, of all months, little Orphea was skipping home, fur-clad, thinking of her mother's caterpillar pies and stone tea, and she was stopped by a curious sound in a nearby alley and paused, as girls ought never to do, to listen. It was a clacking and a dragging and a chirping and a moaning. Orphea, with her curls close round her chin, twisted her weasel tail belt and peeked round the corner, only to glimpse a basilisk, his head bloodied and baleful, clambering up the cobbles. She gasped and hid herself, for even poor girls hear stories. Now Orphea knew well that the gaze of the basilisk turns flesh to stone, but oh, foolhardy Orphea! She had to look again, to have a thing to tell her mother, to have a thing to tell her friend, who knew well enough all the wonders of the Duke's residence and needed nothing less than to hear once more how much better her own shoes were than a pauper's. It was smaller than she'd imagined, the size of a wildcat or a large pig. It was a four-legged serpent covered in a cockerel's feathers, all black and red and pale gold, and its face twisted into scaly, peeling, greenish-brown beak. Upon its head was fixed an iron mitre, which pinched terribly, and that the young girl could plainly see. Trickles of blood had dried around the bands. It moaned and pulled itself up the steep turn, its jaw broken and scabbed. Its feet, red sandstone, pocked and prickled, the very stone of the streets and walks and campaniles of Agenab. And we have a basilisk here. They scraped along the road, sending up the occasional spark. Now it is well known that young women with golden curls and blue eyes are afflicted with a certain fatal innocence. Thus it is that in Agenab, where the local coloring tends toward the dark and coppery, there are so many clever, cunning girls. But in pity, as her folk are compelled to do by some inner song which sings not to others, Orphea cried out and went to the poor beast. Imagine the aria, floating high and pitiful. She wrapped her arms around it, loosened the mitre, and rubbed its shattered jaw. The creature looked at her in horror, glaring and gazing with all its might. Yet Orphea lived, warm and sweet. "Why do you not turn to stone? I demand that you turn to stone immediately," roared the basilisk. But his voice was rough and sibilant, and as it too was all of red sandstone. Orphea's gentle brow furrowed. "I do not rightly know. But is it not fortunate for you that I do not? I can clean your wounds and make you well. It's as easy to sew flesh as organdy." The basilisk sniffed her from neck to ankle, and when his beak grazed her ham, he recoiled. "What sort of creature goes about swathed in weasel skin? I am quite sure that is not the height of fashion." The girl understood him well enough, for many of her friends and uncles in the tall tenements were often as drunk and slurred as a mutilated basilisk. "I am not the height of fashion myself," she shrugged. "Weasel is the enemy of the basilisk, forever and for all time. It is but the thickness of a dress which protects you from me." "Then I am thankful for it, and I will make you right again." "It is but the thickness of a dress, Then I am thankful for it, and I will make you right again. But what has happened to you, poor beast?" The basilisk squirmed out of Orphea's arms, nipped her briefly, just to see what girl tasted like, and sighed his resignation. Whipping his tail round him in an oddly feline gesture, he began, his tongue stone wagging pitifully. The tale of the tongue. The tongue of a basilisk is a valuable thing. A thin veneer of skin, thinner than a manuscript page, hides a muscle all of fire, and with this we hunt and eat tasty hens and seabirds and pretty little finches. You might think it is wicked of the basilisk to eat hens, but we will eat what we like, and if what we like is you, woe to your bones. In the lands where the sun is hotter than a thrice-struck blade and the earth is parched as a throat, it is known by even the smallest child that the basilisk were born when a hen, her feathers warm and golden, saw a clutch of serpent's eggs whose mother had been eaten by barbarous, base, and blackguard weasels, and being kind in her chicken's heart, sat upon the eggs until they hatched. Hens ought not to sit upon things which are not theirs. One of the little brutes ate her right up, with bits of shell still clinging to her pate. And then, being a wise beast, she began to look for Weasel, who had chewed on her mother's backbone. Ah, but Weasel is tricky, is he not? She could not touch him. When she found him in his filthy hole, though she lashed her fiery tongue at his tail and reached for his furry throat with her throttling claws, and glared until the grass itself had turned to stone. "What have I done?" cried Weasel, trickster cunning. "I was only hungry. I have my own babies to feed." But we were not fooled. Weasel may seem sweet, so may anything. Weasel had eaten our mother, and she must have been a great serpent. Cry woe and harm. How shall we know her now that Weasel has taken her from us? For her green meat in her murder made him by some dread alchemy immune to the tricks of her children. And Weasel is wicked, and we shall not forget. But here we are, feathered and scaled and delighted to turn things to stone and burn birds into supper in midair. We make it our business to search out Weasel in all his horrid haunts. But in these degenerate days, this is more of a hobby for a basilisk than a quest. Weasel breeds quickly and is wretched, while basilisk breeds slowly and is noble. Instead, we take great joy in our art. For who in the wide world can sculpt in better fashion than we? Who need but glance at a thing to make its likeness in stone perfect and fell? We are each of us capable of casting a certain stone. My eye is prone to red sandstone, plain and sorry, though it may be. I have in my time glanced at kings and queens, maidens and youths, soldiers and farmers, corn and wheat and peas and melons, dogs with bells on their collars, horses with fringes on their reins, cows with wet noses, a few lions, many lizards, and Weasel, always Weasel, wherever he lies. Of these I have made many fine works, statues where sparrows rest in the eye sockets, a pietà that babes still come from far and wide to see. Only Weasel escapes my gaze. But then, perhaps one ought not to immortalize a rat and a coward. I took the mitre after a war widow lifted her daughter from the wreckage field and weeping toward heaven was caught in my stare. In me she became art, and her bleeding child with her, and it is true what I tell you, that even now she stands in that mud mire as a war memorial, and children pile up roses and scallions and peppermints at her feet. My brothers saw this was worthy and good. They wedged the mitre onto my head, and it hurt, but I was proud that day. Thus it was that I was not afraid when 3 women approached me, shading their eyes and singing a dirge. I would make of them graces and goddesses cast in sandstone, scarlet and shining. As they came close, however, I revised my plan and decided to make them demons, for they were terribly cut and bruised, their breasts severed and bandaged, black blood staining their white frocks, their hair a mess of writhing snakes which seemed exhausted, their forked tongues lying on their mistress's shoulders, their green skin flushed and unhealthy black. Out of the mouths of each maid trickled a half-dried spit of blood, and they would not look at me, being cunning maids of no gold locks. No matter, I still had my tongue, and I flicked it at them experimentally. I am interested in the varying tastes of humans. As I have heard, in many ways it is similar to weasels. They stepped back quickly, as though from the frothing edge of the sea. Still they shaded their eyes and would not look at me. I shook my feathers. "What is it you want? You're too clever by half, so you might as well speak." But they would not. They closed their eyes and opened their mouths as one, and I saw that their tongues had been hacked out so far back that I could not see the stumps. "Has Weasel done this to you?" I asked. It must here be admitted that we basilisks are often somewhat narrow in our understanding of horrid deeds. There is only Weasel who is wicked, and basilisk who is noble. They shook their heads and shuddered. From their skirts they drew a little mirror, and I recoiled, but they chased me with its tiny glass, and I caught my eye in its rim. But only one eye. The women had only a small mirror, a circle of silver, and I could not see all myself. But But I was rooted to the spot nonetheless, and I could feel the beginnings of stone tickling at my claws. Do you know it feels something like your foot falling asleep, the prickles of blood drifting away where you cannot reclaim it? I watched my one rolling eye in the glass, its iris and its white, and I could not look away. And so I stood there while they cut my tongue out of my head, and bloody and dripping shoved it into one of their waiting, empty mouths. And we will pick up there on Sunday night. So we may remember the girls without tongues from the first book of the Orphan's Tales. And the seal and the selkie, or the selkie and the satyr, and we're getting to the point where there's a lot of connections in each tale. The Opera Ghetto is actually what they call a neighborhood in Inwood, New York, where I was staying when I was writing part of this. And there's so many musicians that live there practicing all the time, that it's sort of the nickname of the neighborhood. And I thought that was just amazing and wonderful, and it very much inspired this section of the book. Are there any questions? What class am I teaching after this? I'm actually doing a bookstore event for a space opera after this. I would tell you about it, but I don't think it's public. It's for a book club. So yes, I must admit, Basilisk, because I'm sometimes single-minded. I do love my... I think there's something of Wallace Shawn about my basilisks, and I love that in them, the sort of practicality of life as one of these mythical creatures is one of my favorite things to do in fiction, and I get to do it a lot, or got to do it a lot in the Orphan's Tales. Wallace Shawn the Basilisk. That should just go on the back cover of the book, really. That'll sell it. Yeah. Well, I'll do my outro, and if you have any other questions, you can pop them up into the chat. As usual, this has not been an audiobook of the Orphan's Tales. This has been a play. You can get music based on these books at sjtucker.com. You can get copies of them at your local independent bookseller's web portal. If you would like to use mine and support my local independent bookstore, it is printbookstore.com. You can find me on Twitter at Cat Valenti. You can subscribe to my Patreon at Cat Valenti, which is one of the best ways to support me. You can catch up in the archive at Cat Valenti Live on YouTube. And if you are so moved, you can support this reading and all of my other work by leaving anything you like in the tip jar, which is on my Instagram profile, my YouTube profile, and my website, catherinemvalenti.com. You don't have to. These are entirely free. It's very tight time for us artists and freelancers as we make hay in the ruins of Agenab. And anything that you give would be deeply appreciated, and I will thank you by name on the next stream. Weasel absolutely becomes mythic. It's capitalized in the book, so it becomes, it's, you know, all weasels are one weasel, and it's very much sort of a trickster god figure that is also any actual weasel the basilisk comes across. The thing with the mitre on the head, that's actually from Medieval Bestiaries of the Basilisk. One of the things I wanted to do here, I do remember, was have an actual basilisk, instead of sort of the J.K. Rowling, it's just a giant snake basilisk. They're really weird creatures. They are not just serpents, and they're not just feathered serpents either. They are small and strange, and they have bishop's mitres on that's the funky pope hat. It's called a mitre. A bishop's hat on their head. They are very odd, and their enmity with weasels also comes out of Medieval Bestiaries, so I did not entirely invent that myself. I wanted to have a real funky basilisk, just like there's a real unicorn, described the way that they were in Bestiaries. I am a big fan of Medieval Bestiaries, and you couldn't come up with weirder. The Lucrata in the first book is right out of the Aberdeen Bestiary as well. So yeah, one of the big goals was to have a proper old school OG original gangster basilisk. So hopefully he is that. Thank you all so much for coming tonight. We'll be back at 8:30 p.m. On Sunday night. Yeah, who knows where that, probably 8 bishops. I mean, really, where else are you going to get a good mitre these days? They're not overly nice creatures, the basilisk, but misunderstood, as all monsters are. So yeah, I'll see you guys on Sunday. Thank you so much for coming tonight to this special session. You guys are the hardcore fans who show up every time. It's lovely to see you, to see your very familiar names come up in the chat, and I will look forward to seeing them again over the weekend and many others as well. Have a lovely night, guys.